The diamond ring spun through the air like a tiny glittering missile, catching the fluorescent courtroom lights as it arced toward Judge Judy's bench. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. Every single person in that courtroom stopped breathing. The bailiff lunged forward instinctively, his hand outstretched, but he was a half-second too late. The ring, a flawless 4-carat diamond worth more than most Americans earn in 2 years, struck the wooden surface of Judge Judy's bench with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent chamber like a gunshot. It bounced once, skittered across the polished wood, and came to rest directly in front of America's toughest television judge. The woman who threw it stood trembling with rage, her designer suit heaving with each furious breath, her face twisted into something ugly that no amount of money could ever fix. But Judge Judy did not flinch. She did not gasp. She did not even blink. She simply looked down at the ring sitting on her bench, reached out with 2 steady fingers, and picked it up. She held it to the light for exactly 3 seconds, turning it slowly as if appraising not just the stone but the soul of the woman who had hurled it. Then she set it down gently and spoke 8 words that would be replayed over 100 million times across every social media platform on the planet. 8 words so devastating, so perfectly aimed, that the woman who threw that ring collapsed back into her chair like she had been physically struck and did not utter a single sound for an entire minute. The courtroom was frozen. The audience was frozen. America was frozen. And the most explosive courtroom moment in television history had only just begun. But before we show you exactly what Judge Judy said, before we reveal the words that ended a billionaire wife's reputation and made this the most viral courtroom clip the internet has ever seen, you need to understand who these 2 women were and how a simple wage dispute between a millionaire's wife and her former housekeeper turned into a full-blown national scandal that would trigger federal investigations and destroy a family empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Victoria Ashworth Collins arrived at the courthouse that morning in a black chauffeured Escalade with tinted windows. She stepped out wearing a cream-colored Chanel suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, her blonde hair freshly styled, her makeup applied with the precision of someone who had a professional team on retainer for exactly these kinds of public appearances. On her finger sat the ring that would soon become the most famous piece of jewelry in courtroom history, a 4-carat diamond set in platinum that her husband, tech billionaire Gregory Collins, had given her on their 10th wedding anniversary. She was flanked by a private attorney in a tailored 3-piece suit who carried a leather briefcase stuffed with legal documents and rehearsed arguments. But this was small claims court, and private attorneys were not permitted to argue on behalf of litigants. Victoria had apparently not gotten that memo, or more likely, she simply did not believe that rules applied to someone of her stature. The attorney was forced to take a seat in the gallery like everyone else, and Victoria, for perhaps the first time in her adult life, would have to face a confrontation entirely on her own. Victoria Ashworth Collins was 44 years old and had spent the last 2 decades married to one of the wealthiest men in American tech. She sat on the boards of 3 major charitable foundations. She chaired galas that raised millions. She lived in an 11,000-square-foot mansion with a staff of 9 and a wine collection worth more than most suburban homes. She had grown so accustomed to deference and obedience from every person she encountered that the very concept of being challenged, questioned, or corrected had become foreign to her. She treated waiters like furniture. She spoke to service workers as though they existed solely for her convenience. And she walked into Judge Judy's courtroom that morning with the absolute unshakable confidence of a woman who had never once in her life been told that she was wrong and made to face the consequences. She had no idea that she was walking into the worst day of her entire existence. Sitting at the plaintiff's table, clutching a worn manila folder against her chest, was a woman who could not have been more different. Rosa Delgado was 61 years old. Her hands were rough from decades of physical labor. Her dress was simple and clean but clearly purchased from a discount store. She wore no jewelry, no makeup, and no expression of confidence. What she wore instead was the quiet exhaustion of a woman who had spent 9 years giving everything she had to a family that treated her like she was invisible, and who had then been thrown away the moment she became inconvenient. Rosa had worked as the primary housekeeper for the Ashworth Collins family for nearly a decade. She had cooked their meals, cleaned their mansion, organized their dinner parties, washed their laundry, and cared for their children. She had worked 60 and sometimes 70 hours a week for a flat cash payment of $400, with no overtime, no benefits, no written contract, and no legal protections of any kind. And then, 8 months ago, Rosa had been diagnosed with breast cancer. When she told Victoria and asked for 2 weeks off for surgery, Victoria had fired her on the spot, cancelled the informal health coverage she had verbally promised years earlier, and refused to pay Rosa for her final 2 weeks of work. 9 years of loyalty erased in 30 seconds. Rosa was now suing for $15,000 in unpaid wages, wrongful termination damages, and the cost of medical bills that had nearly bankrupted her family. But here is what makes this case absolutely extraordinary. This was not just about unpaid wages and a wrongful firing. What Judge Judy would discover about Victoria's background during the course of this hearing, and what Rosa had been quietly carrying inside a small sealed envelope tucked inside her purse, would transform this case from a routine employment dispute into the single most explosive and devastating courtroom confrontation ever broadcast on American television. The ring throw that stunned the nation was not the climax of this story. It was merely the moment when Victoria's carefully constructed world began to crack. What came before it and what came after it would leave the entire country speechless. What exactly did Judge Judy say when she picked up that diamond ring and examined it under the courtroom lights? What was hidden inside the envelope that Rosa had been carrying for months, waiting for exactly the right moment to reveal it? And how did a $15,000 small claims case end up triggering a federal investigation that would cost the Collins family more than their mansion, their cars, and their reputation combined? The answers to those questions are coming. And trust me when I tell you that what you are about to hear is more shocking, more emotional, and more satisfying than anything you have ever witnessed in a courtroom. If you believe hardworking people deserve to be paid for their labor, hit that like button right now, subscribe so you never miss a moment when the rich and entitled finally face real consequences, and drop your city in the comments so we can see where justice lovers are watching from all around the world. The story of Victoria Ashworth Collins and Rosa Delgado begins not in a courtroom but in the marble-floored foyer of an 11,000-square-foot mansion where a quiet woman with rough hands and a gentle voice spent 9 years building someone else's life while her own slowly fell apart. And it ends with a diamond ring spinning through the air in 8 words that proved once and for all that no amount of money can buy you dignity when you never had any to begin with. Rosa Delgado came to America 30 years ago with nothing but a small suitcase and a promise she had made to herself that her children would have a better life than the one she left behind in Guatemala. She spoke almost no English when she arrived. She had no connections, no savings, and no safety net of any kind. What she had was a willingness to work harder than anyone around her and a quiet, unbreakable determination that would carry her through 3 decades of sacrifice that most people cannot even imagine. She cleaned houses. She scrubbed floors on her hands and knees. She washed other people's dishes and folded other people's laundry and organized other people's lives while her own life was held together by nothing more than sheer willpower and the love she had for her 3 children. When her husband Miguel was killed in a construction accident just 4 years after they arrived in America, Rosa did not stop. She could not stop. She buried the man she loved on a Tuesday and went back to work on a Wednesday because her children needed to eat and there was no one else coming to save them. For 26 years after that, Rosa Delgado never missed a single day of work. Not one. She started working for the Collins family 9 years ago when Victoria and Gregory's first child was born. Victoria had posted an ad looking for a full-time housekeeper, and Rosa, whose reputation in the community for hard work and reliability was impeccable, was recommended by a family friend. The job seemed like a blessing. The pay was steady, the home was in a safe neighborhood, and Victoria initially presented herself as warm and appreciative. Rosa threw herself into the work the way she had always done, giving everything she had without reservation or complaint. She cooked every meal for the family from scratch. She cleaned the 11,000 square foot mansion from top to bottom every single day. She washed and pressed the family's clothes, organized Victoria's elaborate dinner parties and holiday celebrations, maintained the household inventory, and managed the daily routines that kept the Collins home running like a perfectly tuned machine. When the children were young, it was Rosa who fed them breakfast while Victoria slept in. It was Rosa who packed their lunches and helped them with homework and dried their tears when they fell down in the yard. It was Rosa who held the household together while Victoria spent her days at the spa, at charity lunches, at designer boutiques, spending money that Rosa's labor helped to protect and preserve. From the very beginning, Victoria insisted on paying Rosa in cash. No written contract. No pay stubs. No tax documentation. No formal record of employment of any kind. Victoria told Rosa this arrangement was better for both of them, that it would keep things simple and avoid unnecessary paperwork and taxes. Rosa, who did not fully understand American employment law and who feared that questioning her employer might cost her the job she desperately needed, agreed without protest. For 9 years, Rosa received $400 per week in cash handed to her in an envelope every Friday. There was never a raise. There was never a bonus at Christmas. There was never overtime pay, despite the fact that Rosa regularly worked 60 and sometimes 70 hours in a single week. No paid holidays. No sick days. No health benefits. No retirement contribution. When you calculate $400 against 65 hours of work, it comes out to roughly $6.15 per hour. Far below the federal minimum wage. Far below what any human being deserves for the kind of backbreaking labor Rosa performed every single day for nearly a decade. The cruelest part of Rosa's experience was not the low pay or the long hours. It was the way Victoria treated her as a person. To Victoria, Rosa was simultaneously invisible and essential. She expected Rosa to be available at all hours of the day and night, to cancel her own family gatherings without complaint when Victoria decided at the last minute to throw a dinner party, to work every holiday including Christmas and Thanksgiving without extra compensation. But Victoria never once asked Rosa about her own life. She never learned the names of Rosa's 3 children. She never asked about Rosa's health or her family or her dreams or anything at all that would have acknowledged Rosa as a full human being rather than a piece of household equipment. When guests came to the mansion for Victoria's famous parties, Victoria either failed to introduce Rosa at all or referred to her simply as the help, as though Rosa had no name and no identity beyond the tasks she performed. Rosa endured every slight, every dismissal, every moment of being treated as less than human because the job was steady and her family depended on her income, and she had learned long ago that survival sometimes requires swallowing your pride and doing your work in silence. 8 months before this courtroom confrontation, Rosa's world collapsed. She was diagnosed with breast cancer. The news came during a routine checkup that she had put off for months because she could not afford to miss a day of work. When Rosa told Victoria about the diagnosis, she did so with the same quiet dignity that had defined her entire working life. She asked for just 2 weeks off to undergo surgery and begin her initial treatment. She offered to arrange and pay for a temporary replacement out of her own pocket so that Victoria's household would not be disrupted. Rosa was not asking for charity. She was not asking for sympathy. She was asking for the most basic human consideration from a woman she had served faithfully for 9 years. Victoria's response was instantaneous and devastating. She looked at Rosa with the same expression she might give a piece of furniture that had become stained and said, "I cannot have someone sick around my children, and you are done." Rosa was fired that day. No severance payment. No final paycheck for her last 2 weeks of work. No reference letter. Victoria cancelled the informal health coverage she had verbally promised Rosa years earlier, coverage that Rosa was now desperately counting on to help pay for her cancer treatment. 9 years of loyalty, 9 years of cooking and cleaning and caring and sacrificing, erased in 30 seconds by a woman who could not be bothered to show a dying employee even the smallest measure of human compassion. What followed was the darkest period of Rosa's life. Without income and without health insurance, her modest savings were devoured by medical bills within 2 months. Her oldest daughter Elena took a second job working overnight shifts at a warehouse to help cover expenses. Rosa's church community organized fundraisers and meal deliveries. Neighbors brought groceries. But the bills kept mounting and the cancer kept requiring treatment, and Rosa, even while enduring chemotherapy that left her weak and nauseated and barely able to stand, tried to find new work so she would not be a burden on the people who loved her. Every application went nowhere because Victoria, when contacted by potential employers, told them that Rosa was unreliable and dishonest. The woman who had stolen 9 years of Rosa's labor at below minimum wage was now actively sabotaging her ability to survive. It was Rosa's daughter Elena who finally said enough. She sat with her mother at the kitchen table and together they assembled the evidence that Rosa had been quietly maintaining for years. Inside a small envelope, Rosa carried a handwritten ledger, a simple notebook in which she had recorded every single week of her employment for 9 years. Every date. Every hour worked. Every task performed. Every cash payment received. Every time Victoria had changed the terms, added responsibilities, or reduced her pay for arbitrary reasons. The ledger was meticulous, consistent, and devastating. But the ledger was not the only thing inside that envelope. Rosa also carried something else, something that Victoria had no idea existed, something that would transform this case from a simple wage dispute into the most explosive courtroom moment of the entire season. Victoria Ashworth Collins approached the defendant's table the way she approached everything in her life, as though the entire room existed for her benefit. Her white Chanel suit was immaculate. Her Birkin bag, a soft cream leather piece that retailed for more than Rosa earned in 6 months, sat on the table beside her like a silent declaration of status. The diamond ring on her finger caught the courtroom lights with every gesture, throwing tiny rainbows across the wood paneling as if even her jewelry demanded attention. She did not look at Rosa when she entered. She did not acknowledge her former housekeeper's existence in any way. She simply took her seat, crossed her legs, and looked up at Judge Judy with the polite but unmistakable condescension of someone who believed this entire proceeding was a minor inconvenience that would soon be resolved in her favor. Victoria's opening statement was a masterpiece of rehearsed victimhood. She spoke with the smooth confidence of a woman who had practiced her lines in front of a mirror, framing herself not as an employer who had exploited a vulnerable worker but as a generous benefactor who had been taken advantage of by an ungrateful employee. Rosa was frequently late, Victoria claimed. Her work had become substandard over the final year. The termination was purely performance-based and had absolutely nothing to do with Rosa's health situation. "Of course I feel terrible about her illness," Victoria said, tilting her head with practiced sympathy that never quite reached her eyes. "But I cannot keep someone on staff who is not meeting the standards my family requires." She produced printed character references from 3 of her wealthy friends, each one attesting to Victoria's generosity, fairness, and exemplary treatment of household staff. The letters were written on expensive stationery and signed with flourishing signatures that meant absolutely nothing in a court of law. Judge Judy listened to all of this without expression. Then she began asking questions, and the careful architecture of Victoria's performance started to crack. Judge Judy's first questions were calm, almost conversational, the kind that lulled arrogant defendants into believing they were having a friendly chat rather than walking through a minefield. She asked Victoria to describe the employment arrangement. Victoria called it a casual, mutually beneficial arrangement and insisted that Rosa was more of an independent contractor than a traditional employee. Judge Judy asked for a W-2 form. Victoria did not have one. Judge Judy asked for a 1099. Victoria did not have one. Judge Judy asked for a written employment agreement of any kind. Victoria had nothing. Judge Judy asked for pay stubs or any documentation of the payments made to Rosa over 9 years. Victoria waved her hand dismissively and said that cash payments made things simpler for everyone involved. The calm in Judge Judy's expression tightened by exactly 1 degree, a shift so subtle that only people who had watched her for decades would have recognized it as the first tremor before an earthquake. Then Judge Judy asked a question that would begin Victoria's unraveling in earnest. She asked Victoria what Rosa's hourly rate worked out to, given the weekly payment and the hours she worked. Victoria, sensing danger for the first time, quickly claimed that Rosa only worked about 20 hours per week. Judge Judy paused. Then she asked Victoria to describe, in specific detail, everything Rosa did during a typical day in the Collins household. And Victoria, unable to resist the opportunity to showcase the grandeur and complexity of her home, began listing Rosa's responsibilities with the pride of someone describing a well-oiled machine. The cooking of 3 daily meals from scratch. The cleaning of an 11,000-square-foot home including 7 bathrooms. The laundry for a family of 5. The organization of dinner parties and holiday events. The childcare responsibilities. The grocery shopping. The household inventory management. By the time Victoria finished her detailed description of Rosa's daily duties, she had inadvertently painted a picture of a workload that could not possibly be completed in 20 hours a week. Judge Judy did the math out loud, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. $400 divided by 60 hours is $6.67 per hour. The federal minimum wage is $7.25. You were paying this woman below minimum wage for 9 years, Mrs. Collins. Victoria's mouth opened to respond, but nothing came out. What happened next made the audience gasp audibly. Rosa, who had been sitting silently through Victoria's testimony, began to speak, trying to add context to one of Victoria's claims. Before she could finish her first sentence, Victoria turned in her chair, looked directly at Rosa, raised a manicured finger to her lips, and said "shh" with the casual authority of someone silencing a misbehaving pet. The sound cut through the courtroom like glass. Several audience members inhaled sharply. The bailiff's jaw tightened visibly. And Judge Judy's expression transformed into something that regular viewers recognized instantly as the look that preceded complete and total destruction. Judge Judy pressed forward on the termination, asking Victoria to explain why she fired Rosa during active cancer treatment. Victoria maintained her performance narrative. Judge Judy asked for written warnings documenting Rosa's alleged performance issues. Victoria had none. Judge Judy asked for incident reports. Victoria had none. Judge Judy asked for any formal record at all indicating that Rosa's work was substandard at any point during her 9 years of employment. Victoria's response sealed her fate. "I did not think I needed to document everything for my housekeeper," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand that suggested the very idea of accountability toward a domestic worker was beneath her. Judge Judy's reply was ice-cold and precise. "You documented nothing because there was nothing to document. You fired a loyal employee because she got cancer. That is not a performance issue, Mrs. Collins. That is a character issue." Victoria's composure began to fracture visibly. Her rehearsed calm gave way to a simmering anger as she realized that Judge Judy was not going to accept her version of events, was not going to be charmed or impressed or intimidated by her wealth and status. She interrupted Judge Judy twice and was warned sharply both times. Then, with the reckless confidence of a woman who had never been corrected by anyone she could not fire, Victoria delivered the comment that would mark the point of no return. "Your Honor, with all due respect, you clearly do not understand how household staffing works in homes like mine." The courtroom temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Judge Judy's eyes narrowed into the expression that had ended careers, shattered egos, and broken down the most arrogant litigants in television history. And somewhere inside Rosa's worn purse, the small envelope containing evidence that Victoria did not know existed waited silently for its moment. Rosa Delgado stood slowly from her chair. The movement was careful and deliberate, the kind of cautious rising that belongs to a body that has been through months of chemotherapy and knows its own limits. Her frame was thinner than it had been 9 years ago when she first walked through the doors of the Collins mansion. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached into her worn purse and pulled out the small envelope that had been sitting there quietly throughout the entire hearing, waiting for this exact moment. But when Rosa spoke, her voice carried none of the frailty of her body. It was steady and clear, the voice of a woman who had spent 9 years in silence and had finally decided that the world was going to hear her truth whether it was comfortable or not. She opened the envelope and handed Judge Judy a small notebook, its cover softened and creased from years of handling, its pages filled edge to edge with careful handwriting in blue ink. Judge Judy took the notebook and opened it. The courtroom went silent as she began to read. For 30 full seconds, she said nothing. She simply turned the pages, her eyes moving across the entries with the focused attention of someone who understood immediately what she was looking at and recognized its devastating significance. The notebook was a handwritten ledger that Rosa had maintained every single week for 9 years without a single gap. Each entry recorded the date, the hours Rosa had worked that week, the specific tasks she had performed, and the amount Victoria had paid her. The handwriting was consistent throughout, the same careful lettering on the first page as on the last, written in the same blue ink that had faded naturally over the years in a way that no forger could replicate. The ledger showed that Rosa had worked an average of 63 hours per week across her entire employment. It showed specific weeks where Victoria had arbitrarily reduced Rosa's pay by $25 or $50 for reasons Rosa had noted beside each entry: a wine glass that was not spotless enough, a guest bedroom that Victoria claimed smelled wrong, a dinner party where the dessert was served 2 minutes late. The ledger showed every single holiday Rosa had worked without extra compensation, including 9 Christmases, 9 Thanksgivings, and 9 New Year's days. And it showed the exact date Rosa was terminated, along with a final entry noting that her last 2 weeks of pay were never delivered. Victoria's reaction to the ledger was immediate and spectacularly foolish. She let out a sharp laugh, the kind of dismissive sound that belongs in a country club lounge rather than a courtroom, and turned toward Judge Judy with an expression of exaggerated disbelief. "You cannot be serious," she said, gesturing toward the notebook with a flick of her manicured hand. "You are going to believe a handwritten notebook over my word. Anyone could have written that last week. It is a piece of paper with scribbles on it." Judge Judy looked up from the ledger and fixed Victoria with a stare that could have frozen a river in July. "This notebook," she said with a precision that sliced through Victoria's mockery like a surgical instrument, "contains 9 years of consistent entries in the same handwriting with the same ink, with specific details that correspond to verifiable calendar dates, including days of the week that match the actual calendar for each year. Unless Mrs. Delgado has been planning an elaborate fraud since 2015 and possesses the supernatural ability to artificially age ink on paper, I find this ledger considerably more credible than your complete and total lack of any documentation whatsoever." Victoria's laugh died in her throat. The audience shifted in their seats, the energy in the courtroom tightening like a wire being pulled taut. But Rosa was not finished. She reached into the envelope again and this time pulled out a small digital voice recorder. She placed it on the edge of the table with the quiet care of someone handling something precious and irreplaceable. Her daughter Elena, she explained softly, had given her the recorder during her final year of working for the Collins family. Elena had listened to her mother come home evening after evening describing the way Victoria spoke to her, the insults, the threats, the casual cruelty delivered in a tone that made it clear Victoria considered Rosa something less than human. Elena had begged her mother to start recording these interactions, and Rosa, after one particularly humiliating evening, had finally agreed. She had captured 3 separate conversations on that small device. Judge Judy asked to hear them, and the bailiff connected the recorder to the courtroom speaker system. The first recording filled the room with Victoria's unmistakable voice berating Rosa over a water spot on a wine glass. The voice was sharp and cutting, dripping with contempt. "You are useless," Victoria said on the recording. "Completely useless. I could find someone who actually wants to work instead of sleepwalking through my house leaving spots on everything." The second recording captured Victoria responding to what had apparently been a gentle request from Rosa for a modest raise after 7 years at the same wage. Victoria's response was chilling in its casual cruelty. You should be grateful I pay you anything at all. Do you know how many people would kill for this job? You have no skills. You have no education. Where exactly do you think you are going to go? The courtroom audience sat in horrified silence, several people visibly shaking their heads as the recordings played. Then came the third recording. The termination itself. Victoria's voice came through the speakers with crystal clarity, each word landing on the courtroom like a hammer blow. I do not want a sick person in my house. My children could catch something. Pack your things and do not come back. And do not expect a paycheck for this week because you barely did anything. There was a pause on the recording, and then Rose's voice came through, trembling but dignified even in the worst moment of her professional life. Mrs. Collins, I have cancer. It is not contagious. Please, I need this job for my treatment. I have worked for you for 9 years. Victoria's reply was the final nail in her own coffin, delivered with the bored indifference of someone swatting away a fly. That is not my problem. Close the door on your way out. The effect on the courtroom was physical. It was as though every person in that room had been struck simultaneously. Audience members pressed their hands over their mouths. Several were crying openly, tears running down their faces without any attempt to hide them. An older woman in the second row clutched the hand of the stranger sitting beside her as if they both needed something to hold on to after hearing what they had just heard. The bailiff, a man whose stoic professionalism had carried him through years of courtroom drama without visible reaction, looked down at the floor and slowly shook his head. Judge Judy listened to the entire recording without moving a single muscle, her face carved from stone, her eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance as Victoria's own words convicted her more thoroughly than any legal argument ever could. Victoria's face had gone the color of chalk. Her hands gripped the edge of the defendant's table so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had not known the recordings existed. She turned desperately toward the gallery where her private attorney sat watching with an expression that made it clear he understood there was nothing he or anyone else could do. The words on that recording were Victoria's own. The cruelty was documented in her own voice. The mask of the generous employer, the charitable socialite, the reasonable woman who had simply made a difficult staffing decision had been ripped away entirely, and what sat exposed beneath it was something the entire courtroom could now see clearly. There was nowhere left to hide. If Rose's courage to stand up after everything she endured gives you chills, smash that subscribe button right now, drop a like for this incredible woman, and comment the name of your city below. Let us see how far this story reaches across the world. Judge Judy removed her glasses and set them on the bench. She looked directly at Victoria with an intensity that made the air feel thin. Mrs. Collins, she began, the ring on your finger is worth more than what you paid this woman in an entire year. You live in an 11,000 square foot home. You drive cars that cost more than most people's houses. And you could not pay the woman who made your life possible a legal wage. You could not give her 2 weeks off for cancer surgery. You could not even let her finish her final week with dignity. This woman raised your children when you were at the spa. She cooked your meals when you were at your galas. She cleaned your home and organized your life for 9 years. And when she needed you, not for money, not for charity, just for basic human decency, you threw her away like she was one of the towels she folded for you every morning. Victoria shot up from her chair, trembling and shrill. You do not know what it is like to manage a household. She was my employee and I had every right to. Judge Judy cut her off. Sit down, Mrs. Collins. Victoria did not sit. She ripped the diamond ring from her finger and hurled it at the bench, screaming, you want to talk about money, then take it, take everything. You people always want what we have. The ring struck the bench and skittered across the wood. The courtroom froze. The bailiff lunged forward. Every camera captured the moment a billionaire's wife threw jewelry at a judge on national television. Judge Judy did not flinch. She picked up the ring between 2 fingers, examined it for 3 seconds, then looked at Victoria and said, "This ring is worth more than your character." She set it down gently. "And your character, Mrs. Collins, is worthless." Victoria collapsed into her chair and did not speak for a full minute. Judge Judy awarded Rosa the full $15,000 covering unpaid wages, wrongful termination, and emotional distress. She recommended the ring throw be reviewed for contempt and assault and directed the court clerk to forward the recordings to the Department of Labor for investigation into wage theft and tax evasion. Then she looked at Rosa. "Mrs. Delgado, you worked with dignity for 9 years. You kept records when no one asked you to. You stood up for yourself when it would have been easier to stay silent. You are not the help. You are the backbone of every family you have ever served. Do not ever forget that." Rosa whispered through her tears, "Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you." Within 90 minutes of the episode airing, the ring throw clip had 4 million views. Within 24 hours it passed 60 million. The phrase "this ring is worth more than your character" became the most shared courtroom quote in social media history. Memes flooded every platform. Reaction videos poured in by the thousands. News networks ran primetime segments dissecting the moment frame by frame. The clip was translated into 30 languages and shared in countries where people had never heard of Judge Judy but instantly understood the universal language of arrogance meeting accountability. Victoria Ashworth Collins had wanted to be famous. She got her wish in the worst possible way. Victoria's world collapsed with stunning speed. She was removed from the boards of 3 charitable organizations within a single week. The Collins family's tax attorney resigned immediately after the IRS opened a formal inquiry into years of unreported cash payments to household employees. 6 former employees of the Collins household came forward with nearly identical stories of cash wages below minimum pay, verbal abuse, and termination without cause, triggering a class action inquiry that threatened to cost the family millions. Gregory Collins issued a public statement distancing himself from his wife's behavior. Their marriage reportedly collapsed within 2 months. Victoria's social media accounts were deleted after receiving hundreds of thousands of comments calling her the most hated woman in America. She was denied entry to a charity gala she had co-chaired for 5 consecutive years. The woman who once ruled Houston's elite social scene became its most notorious outcast, unable to show her face at the restaurants and clubs where she had once held court. Rosa's life took a very different path. A GoFundMe campaign created by viewers who watched the episode raised over $340,000 for her cancer treatment and living expenses. Rosa accepted the funds with humble gratitude and immediately donated $50,000 to a non-profit providing legal aid to domestic workers seeking unpaid wages. Her cancer treatment, now fully funded, showed positive results within months. Her daughter Elena, inspired by her mother's courage in that courtroom, enrolled in law school with a focus on workers' rights. Rosa was invited to speak before a state labor committee considering stronger protections for household employees, and her testimony, delivered with the same quiet, unbreakable strength she had shown before Judge Judy, was credited with helping pass new legislation requiring written contracts and documented pay for all domestic workers in the state. Judge Judy returned the diamond ring to Victoria through the court clerk. Victoria never publicly acknowledged receiving it. When asked about the moment in an interview, Judge Judy said simply, "I have had people throw tantrums in my courtroom for 30 years, but that was the first time someone threw a diamond at me. I was not impressed. A diamond is just a rock. Character is what is truly valuable." And that woman had none. 6 months after the trial, Rosa returned to work, not as a housekeeper but as a community organizer helping domestic workers understand their rights and protect themselves from exploitation. On her first day, she wore a simple silver bracelet her daughter had given her, engraved with the date of the trial. She told a reporter, "For 9 years I was silent. Judge Judy gave me my voice back. Now I use it for others." She paused and smiled. "And I do not need a diamond ring to know my worth." If Rosa's story moved you, if you believe that every hardworking person deserves dignity and respect no matter what job they do, Then hit that like button right now, subscribe so you never miss these moments when justice is finally served, and drop your city in the comments below. Let us show Rosa and every worker like her that the whole world is watching and the whole world cares. Thank you for watching. God bless you, and never forget your character is worth more than any diamond.